Where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments below, because wherever you are, I hope you never have to witness the horror I saw on my own front porch. This is a fictional story, but the lessons it carries are as real and dangerous as a loaded gun. If you believe that families should protect one another, instead of tearing each other apart for a few dollars, hit that like button and subscribe. You are going to want to hear every single word of this. My name is Clifford Dalton. To my neighbors, to the people at the grocery store, and even to my own daughter, Vanessa, I am just a retired truck driver. I am the old man with the calloused hands, the faded flannel shirts, and the slight limp from 40 years of hauling freight across the unforgiving interstates of America. They look at me, and they see a man scraping by on a meager pension. They see a relic of a bygone era, someone who worked hard but never quite made it to the top of the mountain. They have absolutely no idea who I really am. They do not know that the single flatbed truck I bought in my 20s grew into a fleet, and that fleet grew into a massive logistics empire. They do not know that I am the founder, the primary shareholder, and the chairman of Trident Holdings, a conglomerate that owns shipping routes, warehouses, and tech subsidiaries across 3 continents. They do not know that just 2 weeks ago, I was sitting in a penthouse boardroom in Zurich, Switzerland, finalizing the sale of a European shipping subsidiary for a figure that would make their heads spin. I built this empire in the shadows. I kept my wealth hidden behind blind trusts, holding companies, and layers of corporate discretion. Why? Because I grew up with nothing, and I learned early on that money changes people. It twists them. It turns love into a transaction and friendship into an opportunity. I wanted to know who loved me for the man I was, not for the balance in my bank account. My wife, Beatrice, is the only person on this earth who knows the full, staggering extent of our fortune. But Beatrice is a woman of profound grace and simple tastes. She does not care for designer labels or flashy jewelry. She loves the smell of fresh earth in her garden, the quiet rhythm of her knitting needles, and the simple joy of a cup of tea on a rainy afternoon. We have been married for 45 years. She stood by me when we were eating canned beans for dinner, and she stands by me now. Our daughter, Vanessa, on the other hand, was always drawn to the shiny things. When she married Bradley, a man whose naked ambition and entitlement were practically tattooed on his forehead, Beatrice and I were deeply concerned. Bradley was a junior executive with expensive tastes and a shallow character. But Vanessa loved him, and as parents, we wanted to give them a head start. Through one of my anonymous blind trusts, I purchased a sprawling, multi-million-dollar estate in the exclusive neighborhoods of Greenwich, Connecticut. We allowed Vanessa and Bradley to live there completely rent-free. I paid for the extensive renovations. I covered the property taxes. I even pulled a few invisible strings in the corporate world to secure Bradley a highly lucrative position as the chief financial officer at a mid-sized tech firm called Global Tech Solutions. He walked around with his chest puffed out, utterly convinced that he had achieved this success purely on his own merit. All Beatrice and I ever asked in return was simple: that they allow us to stay in the modest guest cottage when we visited, and that they look after Beatrice while I was away on my extended, pension-funded road trips. Recently, Beatrice had undergone a grueling hip replacement surgery. She was fragile. She needed rest, structure, and loving care. I trusted my daughter to provide that. I even trusted that a ruthless corporate climber like Bradley would possess the basic human decency to treat his elderly mother-in-law with respect. I was catastrophically wrong. It was a Tuesday night in late November when my flight landed at JFK Airport. The merger in Zurich had wrapped up faster than anticipated, and I had decided not to call ahead. I wanted to surprise my wife. I missed her warmth, her smile, and the quiet comfort of our shared silence. The weather was atrocious. It was raining sideways, a cold, biting, miserable rain that soaked right through to your bones. I hailed an Uber, tossing my battered canvas duffel bag into the trunk. As the car wound its way through the manicured, tree-lined streets of the wealthy Greenwich suburbs, a cold knot of anxiety began to form in the pit of my stomach. In business, I have always trusted my gut instinct. It is the internal compass that saved me from bankruptcy more than once. And right then, my gut was screaming that something was fundamentally wrong. The Uber driver pulled up to the imposing iron gates of the estate. Strangely, they were wide open. As we rolled up the long, sweeping driveway, I frowned. The area was packed with luxury vehicles, Mercedeses, sleek BMWs, a couple of Porsches, and even a Bentley. Vanessa had not mentioned anything about hosting a party. I paid the driver, grabbed my duffel bag, and stepped out into the freezing downpour. I stood there for a moment, the rain instantly plastering my gray hair to my forehead, looking up at the magnificent house I had secretly paid for. It was lit up like a beacon in the night. The heavy thumping bass of a smooth jazz playlist vibrated through the damp air, screaming of forced pretension. Shadows moved elegantly behind the sheer curtains. They were having a high society cocktail party. I must have looked like an absolute vagrant, an old, soaking wet man with a slight limp and a cheap bag, trudging toward a multi-million-dollar mansion. I pulled my collar up against the wind and walked toward the massive oak front doors. I was reaching out to press the glowing doorbell when my eyes caught something in the periphery. To the left of the door, tucked away in the deep shadows, away from the warm, inviting glow of the porch sconces, was a pile of what looked like discarded gray rags. It looked like someone had dumped a bundle of dirty laundry out in the freezing rain. Then, the bundle shivered. I froze, my breath hitched in my throat. I dropped my duffel bag, the canvas slapping against the wet stone. My heart began to hammer against my ribs like a trapped bird. It was not laundry, it was a human being. It was a small, incredibly frail person, curled tightly into a fetal position on a thin, filthy rubber doormat. The person was wearing a coarse gray uniform that was at least 2 sizes too big, the hem torn and dragging in the puddles. The hair, which I knew should have been a soft, vibrant brown, was completely gray, unwashed, and matted to the skull. The hands clutching the thin fabric were bright red, cracked, and trembling violently from the near-freezing temperature. It was Beatrice. My knees almost buckled beneath me. The world tilted on its axis. This was my wife. This was the brilliant, beautiful woman who had held my hand when the banks laughed at me, the woman who had built a life with me from scratch. And she was sleeping on the cold, hard porch like a stray dog. "Beatrice," I whispered, the sound tearing from my throat. She did not hear me over the wind. She was muttering something delirious in her sleep, her body racked with uncontrollable shivers as the storm whipped rain across the porch. I reached out, my hand trembling, desperate to touch her, to pull her into my arms and shield her from the cold. But before my fingers could graze her shoulder, the heavy oak front door swung open violently. A wave of warm air, carrying the scent of expensive cologne, roasted duck hors d'oeuvre, and arrogance, spilled out into the night, accompanied by raucous laughter. I instinctively stepped back into the shadows of the pillar. Bradley stepped out onto the porch. He was wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo that fit his athletic frame flawlessly. He held a crystal tumbler filled with amber scotch in one hand. Flanking him were 2 older men I immediately recognized from the covers of financial magazines, prominent venture capitalists he had been desperately trying to court for months. "Gentlemen, I assure you the view of the grounds is absolutely spectacular, even in this dismal rain," Bradley projected, his voice dripping with that oily practiced charm he reserved exclusively for anyone with a net worth over $10 million. He took a confident step forward, sweeping his arm out to gesture at the lawn. Then he stopped. He looked down at Beatrice. He did not look surprised. He did not look concerned, or guilty, or even slightly embarrassed. He looked deeply, profoundly annoyed. The noise of the door and the loud voices had jolted Beatrice awake. She scrambled to push herself into a sitting position, her eyes wide, blown out, and filled with a stark, primal terror. She looked completely disoriented, her movements jerky and stiff from the freezing cold and the agonizing stiffness of her recent hip surgery. "I am so sorry, sir," she stammered, her voice thin, raspy, and broken. I was just resting my eyes for a moment. I will clean it up. I will clean the floor right now." Sir, she had just called our son-in-law, sir." Bradley let out a short, cruel laugh. It was a sound devoid of any humanity. He turned to the 2 wealthy investors, swirling the scotch in his glass. "My profound apologies, gentlemen," Bradley said, gesturing down at my wife with a dismissive wave of his tumbler. "It is honestly so hard to find good help these days. This is our live-in maid. She is a bit touched in the head, if you catch my drift. We keep her around mostly out of charity, but she insists on sleeping out here in the cold. She thinks she is a guard dog. One of the investors chuckled, a nervous, uncomfortable sound. A bit eccentric, is she? You have absolutely no idea, Bradley sneered. Then, he did something that made my vision tunnel, and the world turn the color of blood. Bradley looked down at his pristine patent leather dress shoes. There was a tiny smudge of mud on the toe of the right shoe from stepping too close to the edge of the porch. He looked at Beatrice, who was currently struggling, pressing her fragile hands against the brick wall, desperately trying to push herself up on her bad hip. Bradley extended his right foot. He placed his muddy shoe directly onto the shoulder of Beatrice's torn gray uniform. And he wiped it. He deliberately ground the mud from his sole into the thin fabric covering my wife's frail shoulder, using her as a human doormat. Beatrice flinched violently, shrinking down, bowing her head in total submission. "Stand up straight when guests are present, you crazy old hag," Bradley hissed, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper, though he kept a plastic, charming smile plastered on his face for the benefit of the investors. "You are embarrassing us." That was the exact moment the old Clifford Dalton died. The patient, forgiving father, the quiet, retired truck driver, he evaporated into the freezing rain. The entity that replaced him was something much colder, much darker, and infinitely more dangerous. I stepped out of the shadows. "That is enough," I said. My voice was not particularly loud, but it cut through the pouring rain and the thumping jazz music like a serrated razor blade. Bradley jumped, physically startled. He spun around, sloshing a generous amount of his expensive scotch over the rim of his glass and onto the porch stones. The two venture capitalists turned to look at me, their eyes sweeping over my soaking wet flannel shirt, my faded jeans and my cheap duffel bag. Their expressions immediately morphed into identical masks of aristocratic distaste. "Who the hell are you?" one of the investors demanded, taking a protective step backward. Bradley stared at me, his eyes narrowed. But there was no fear in them. There was no realization that he had just crossed a line he could never uncross. He just looked profoundly disgusted. "Oh, wonderful," Bradley sneered, rolling his eyes as he turned back to his guests. "The circus is officially complete, gentlemen. My deepest apologies again. This is the other charity case I was telling you about." My father-in-law, the retired truck driver, he emphasized the words truck driver with a curling sneer, spitting the words out as if they were the name of a highly contagious disease. He thought the title demeaned me. He didn't know it was the foundation of an empire that could buy his entire firm and sell it for scrap before breakfast. I completely ignored him. I didn't yell. I didn't throw a punch, even though every fiber of my being screamed at me to wrap my hands around his perfectly tailored throat. I walked right past him, deliberately shoving my shoulder into his chest, hard enough to knock him off balance and make him stumble back a step. I dropped to my knees on the hard, wet brick beside my wife. "Bae," I said softly, my voice cracking under the weight of the emotion. "It is me, it is Cliff." She slowly raised her head. Her eyes were heavily glazed, the pupils dilated so wide they looked almost entirely black. She looked directly at me, but she did not see her husband. She flinched away, pulling her knees tight against her chest, pressing herself further into the cold brick wall. No, I did not break the vase," she whimpered, her whole body trembling violently. "Please, sir, do not lock me in the basement again. It is too dark. I will be good. I promise I will be a good maid." Basement, I felt a sudden, agonizing physical pain rip through my chest, sharp and breathtaking. They had been locking her in the basement. They had terrified her, abused her, and broken her mind so thoroughly that she did not even recognize the man she had loved for 4 decades. I gently reached out and took her hands. They were like ice. I quickly stripped off my heavy, lined canvas coat and wrapped it tightly around her frail, shivering shoulders. Behind me, Bradley had regained his footing and his composure. He stepped toward us, looming over my kneeling form like a tyrant. "Look at this pathetic display," Bradley said loudly to his guests, shaking his head with exaggerated pity. "Senility clearly runs deep in the family. Clifford, get her out of here immediately. You are ruining my party and upsetting my guests. Take her around the back to the servants' quarters where she belongs, and keep her quiet." I stood up slowly. I reached down and gently helped Beatrice to her feet, having to support almost her entire weight because her unhealed hip was clearly giving out under her. I turned to face Bradley. The rain dripped steadily from my gray hair, running down my face like cold tears. "You just wiped your shoes on my wife," I stated, my voice dangerously calm. Bradley rolled his eyes, a theatrical sigh escaping his lips. "She is a maid, Clifford, and a completely useless one at that. She spills more soup than she serves. Honestly, we should have put her in a state-run home months ago, but Vanessa has this ridiculous soft spot for useless strays." "You called her a maid," I repeated, committing every detail of his arrogant face to memory. "You stood here and told these men she is your servant." "Because she is," Bradley snapped, his thin veneer of patience finally snapping. He stepped closer, his face turning red. "Look around you, Clifford. This estate costs $50,000 a month just to maintain. Who do you think pays for that? Me, I am the CFO, I bring home the bacon. You two? You are leeches, you live in my guest cottage for free, you eat my food. So yes, if she wants a roof over her head in my house, she earns it. She scrubs the floors, she does the laundry, and if she acts crazy and breaks my things, she sleeps on the mat. That is the rule in my house." He leaned in close, his breath washing over me, foul with the smell of alcohol and rotting morality. "Now, take your crazy wife and get off my porch before I call my security team and have you both thrown face first into the street. I have very important people to impress tonight." I looked over at the two wealthy investors. They were watching this horrific scene with morbid, silent fascination, but neither of them intervened. Neither of them said a word to stop a younger man from abusing an elderly couple. They were complicit in their silence. They were part of the rot. I looked back at Bradley. I memorized the arrogant set of his jaw, the cruel gleam in his eyes, the absolute certainty he had in his own superiority. I wanted to remember exactly what he looked like at the absolute height of his delusional power, because I was going to burn his world to ash. I nodded slowly. "All right, Bradley," I said, my voice dead and flat. "We will go," he smirked, a triumphant, ugly expression. "Good, finally, a rare moment of clarity from the peanut gallery. Go on, scram, and don't come back until she learns how to behave." I tightened my grip on Beatrice's arm, supporting her waist. I led her carefully down the wet stone steps, past the gleaming luxury cars, and out into the torrential rain. I did not turn toward the back of the house. I did not go to the guest cottage. I walked straight down the center of the long driveway, heading toward the iron gates. "Where the hell are you going?" Bradley called out, a hint of confusion suddenly piercing his arrogance. "The servants' quarters are around the back." I did not stop. I did not look back. I pulled out my phone, shielding it from the rain, and summoned the Uber driver who had dropped me off moments ago. He was still waiting just down the street, likely organizing his receipts. We stood together at the massive iron gate in the pouring rain. Beatrice was shaking so violently, I thought her fragile bones might shatter. She leaned her full weight against me. "Cliff," she whispered, a sudden, fleeting moment of lucidity breaking through the dense fog in her mind. "Is that you?" "Yes, honey," I said, my throat constricting, fighting back the tears that threatened to fall. "It is me, I am here, I am so hungry, Cliff," she sobbed, burying her face against my wet chest. "They only give me the cold scraps from the dinner parties. They say I do not deserve fresh food because I am a bad maid," and I dropped a plate. I held her tighter, pulling her completely against me. I felt the rage burning in my gut, a hot, blinding, white-hot fuel I had not felt since my 20s. It was the exact same relentless fire that drove me to buy my first truck when the bank laughed in my face. It was the exact same ruthless fuel that made me systematically crush my competitors when they tried to price me out of the logistics market. The Uber pulled up to the curb, the headlights cutting through the storm. I quickly opened the door and gently helped Beatrice slide inside. The blast of warm air from the car heater hit us like a physical embrace. "Where to, sir?" the driver asked, looking at us through the rearview mirror, his eyes widening with concern at Beatrice's soaked, pitiful appearance. "The St. Regis Hotel in Manhattan," I instructed, "the presidential suite." The driver raised an eyebrow, clearly doubting if the soaked man in flannel could afford a room that cost $5,000 a night, but he wisely stayed quiet and put the car in gear. As we pulled away from the curb, I looked back at the massive glowing mansion one last time. Through the rain, I could see Bradley standing in the open doorway, laughing uproariously with his wealthy guests, turning his back on us and pulling the heavy oak doors shut, locking out the storm and the inconvenient truth. He thought he had won. He thought he had successfully discarded the trash. He firmly believed I was just a broken, destitute old man with no power, no money, and no fight left in him. He had absolutely no idea that he had just declared total war on the billionaire owner of the company that signed his paychecks. He had no idea that the very house he was standing in, the floor he walked on, was legally mine. He had no idea that the luxury car he drove, the custom suit he wore, and the expensive scotch he drank were all paid for by the man he had just called a leech. I gently took Beatrice's freezing hand in both of mine, rubbing it to generate heat. "You are safe now, Bea," I whispered into the quiet of the car. "And I promise you on my life, by the time I am done with that boy, he is going to wish he had never been born." We arrived at the St. Regis Hotel in Manhattan an hour later. The liveried hotel staff did not bat an eyelash at my soaking wet flannel shirt or Beatrice's horrific condition. They simply saw the solid black American Express Centurion card I placed on the mahogany reception desk, and they moved mountains. We were escorted to a sprawling penthouse suite. I ordered warm chicken broth and ran a hot bath. As I gently helped Beatrice out of that filthy maid's uniform, I broke down. She was skin and bones, her arms mottled with dark, ugly bruises shaped like rough handprints. I washed her with agonizing care and tucked her into the king-size bed. As she fell into an exhausted sleep, I pulled out my phone and dialed Leonard Katz, my personal attorney and the most ruthless legal shark in New York. "I am heading to the office right now," Leonard said after I described the horrifying conditions on the porch. "What do you want to do, Clifford?" "I want to destroy him, Leonard. I want to take his house, his cars, his job, and his future. Consider it done, but we need indisputable proof. Take her to a doctor immediately." "I am taking her to Dr. Evans at Mount Sinai in the morning," I said, "and if my daughter Vanessa stood by and watched this happen, treat her as an accomplice." The next morning, Dr. Jonathan Evans met us at the hospital's private entrance. After 2 excruciating hours of exams, John called me into his office, his knuckles white. "She has lost nearly 30 pounds and has pressure sores," John began angrily. "But the toxicology screen is worse. Her blood is saturated with haloperidol and benzodiazepines." "Speak English, John. They were intentionally drugging her," he said grimly. "These are heavy antipsychotics used to sedate violently psychotic patients. They were deliberately poisoning her to mimic advanced dementia so they could legally invalidate her and commit her to an asylum." The rage simmering in my chest exploded. They were systematically destroying her mind to steal my money. "Certify the records," I demanded. I walked out of the hospital, clutching the medical reports, and called Leonard. "Leonard, check the emergency medical trust fund I set up for them," I instructed. "I already did," Leonard replied, typing furiously. 3 months ago, Bradley forged Beatrice's signature to withdraw $200,000, claiming it was for her urgent surgery. "What did he buy?" I demanded. "He bought a Porsche 911 GT3 and put a deposit on a Hamptons rental," Leonard spat. "But it gets worse. 6 months ago, he forged a quitclaim deed to transfer the Greenwich property from your blind trust to himself. He leveraged your house to borrow $1.5 million from predatory lenders. What did he do with it? He invested in a cryptocurrency Ponzi scheme that collapsed 2 weeks ago. The money evaporated. The lenders are threatening foreclosure. Bradley is nearly $2 million in debt and completely insolvent. If his company finds out, he will be fired. He is desperate, Clifford. That is why he was drugging Beatrice." The anger inside me crystallized into something cold and sharp. "Leonard," I commanded, "buy his debt, every single penny. Use my shell company, Obsidian Holdings. By Friday afternoon, I want to be the only person Bradley owes money to in this entire world." "You want to foreclose on him?" Leonard asked. "No, I want to hold the physical notes. I want to strip him naked at his promotion party on Saturday. Find out who his boss is." "His boss is Marcus Sterling, CEO of Global Tech Solutions," Leonard replied. A chilling smile spread across my face. Global Tech Solutions was a mid-tier subsidiary of Trident Holdings, my company. "Get Marcus Sterling on his private line," I instructed. "Tell him the chairman of the board is coming to dinner on Saturday night." and tell him to bring the termination paperwork for his CFO. I stood on the bustling Manhattan sidewalk, the legal trap set. But I had one massive bleeding wound left to address. I needed to hear my daughter lie to me one last time. I pulled out my phone and dialed Vanessa's number. She answered on the fourth ring, sounding anxious and small. "Vanessa," I said coldly. "It is Dad. I am at the hospital with your mother." Instead of asking if Beatrice was safe, she went immediately on the defensive. "Dad, you have to bring her back right now. Bradley is furious. He says you kidnapped her and ruined his party." "He didn't kidnap her, Vanessa. I rescued her. Dr. Evans found the antipsychotics. The sedatives you two have been feeding her to make her look crazy. She was being difficult." She hissed, panicking. "Bradley said she needed medication to calm down. He couldn't handle the stress of her making messes." "And what about you?" I asked, my heart turning to stone. "You watched him wipe his muddy shoes on your mother. You watched her sleep on a wet doormat. Why didn't you stop him?" "I couldn't," she sobbed, the ugly truth spilling out. "He threatened to cut me off. I don't have any money of my own, Dad. I couldn't risk losing the Range Rover and the credit cards. You willingly traded your mother's sanity and dignity for a leased SUV and a monthly allowance," I whispered. "Dad, please just bring her back." "Vanessa," I said, cutting through her panic. "Do not ever call me Dad again." I hung up the phone. The daughter I had raised was gone. When I returned to the hotel suite, Beatrice's drug withdrawal began. She shook violently for a full day, sweating through the silk sheets. But by Friday morning, the chemical fog finally lifted. She sat up in bed, her eyes sharp and piercing. "I remember everything, Cliff," she rasped. "I do not want to go back to that house looking like a victim. I want to walk in there, looking like the person who owns the mortgage. I have already arranged exactly that." I smiled. While she rested, I orchestrated the final trap. I needed a legal cage Bradley could not talk his way out of. I called Arthur "Artie" Vance, a retired predatory hedge fund manager who owed me a massive life debt. "I am sitting in the SUV across from the coffee shop," Artie rasped through the phone a few hours later. "He is walking in now. Make sure he physically signs the document," I reminded him. I put on my headphones, tapping into Artie's secure audio feed. I listened as Bradley confidently pitched a fake cryptocurrency algorithm, desperately trying to secure seed capital. "I am willing to write you a check for $5 million today, but I need hard collateral." "Real estate," Artie said smoothly. "Like that massive estate you live in, is it yours?" "Free and clear?" "Yes," Bradley lied seamlessly. "Then we have a deal. I just need you to sign this federal affidavit stating, under penalty of perjury, that you are the sole legal owner of the property." Signing that document was textbook wire fraud, a federal crime carrying decades in prison. "Signed," Bradley said, his pen scratching loudly. Minutes later, Artie confirmed the notarized document was secured. The trap had snapped shut. Bradley Thompson was now a federal felon. The transformation of Beatrice was miraculous. An elite styling team dyed her graying hair a rich chestnut and erased the pallor of malnutrition with expensive serums. She stepped into a $12,000 midnight blue velvet gown, the long sleeves hiding her bruised arms. I fastened a heavy platinum and diamond necklace around her throat. "You look terrifying," I told her. "Good," she replied. I donned a bespoke black tuxedo with solid gold cufflinks. The stooped truck driver vanished. The chairman of Trident Holdings had returned. I hired 4 ex-military private security guards and a black-on-black Rolls-Royce Phantom. As we glided up the driveway of the Greenwich estate, I texted Leonard Katz, "File the criminal complaint. Send the fraud affidavit to Marcus Sterling's phone right now." We parked in the shadows. Through the open doors, we watched Bradley standing on the grand staircase, addressing his wealthy guests and the global tech board members. "Success comes with a heavy price," Bradley projected smoothly. "You all know we opened our home to my elderly in-laws. But dementia is a cruel thief. This week, their paranoia got the better of them. They refused our help and ran away into the night." The crowd murmured in deep sympathy. "To offer someone dignity, only to have them spit in your face." Bradley lied flawlessly. "But we carry the weight for those who cannot. Drink to family. Here, here." The crowd cheered. Beatrice looked at me. "He thinks we are ghosts. Then let us show him what a haunting really looks like." I signaled the security team. The lead guard stepped forward, pushing the heavy oak doors open with a thunderous boom. The chatter stopped instantly. Bradley froze on the staircase. We stood framed in the doorway, a titan in a bespoke tuxedo and a blazing queen in velvet and diamonds. The silence in the room was absolute. I took one slow step forward. Bradley's jaw hung open in pure shock. His brain could not reconcile the broken old man he had kicked out into the rain with the powerful billionaire standing before him. "Is that the maid?" Someone whispered in awe. "No joke, Bradley," I said, my voice echoing in the hall. "Since you invited your entire board of directors, I thought it was the perfect opportunity to introduce myself properly." I turned my head slightly, locking eyes with Marcus Sterling, the CEO of Global Tech, who was standing near the massive stone fireplace. He held a glass of untouched scotch. He looked incredibly pale, but he nodded at me, a sharp, deeply respectful acknowledgement. Bradley saw the look. He saw his boss, the CEO he worshipped, bowing his head to his supposedly senile father-in-law. The last vestige of color drained from Bradley's face completely, leaving him gray and ashen. I turned back to Bradley. "You see, Bradley, you made a catastrophic mistake. You looked at a book and judged it entirely by its cover. You looked at a man who drove a truck and assumed he was poor. You looked at a woman who loved to garden and assumed she was weak. And because of that arrogant assumption, you thought you could hurt us. You thought you could steal from us. You thought you could erase us." I reached slowly into my tuxedo pocket. The sound of the silk fabric rustling was loud in the dead quiet room. Bradley actually flinched, shrinking back against the banister as if he expected me to pull out a gun. Instead, I pulled out a folded document. It was the affidavit he had signed in the coffee shop with Arthur Vance. "But you forgot the absolute first rule of finance, Bradley," I said, holding the paper up high for him to see. "Always know exactly who holds the note." Bradley stared at the paper, the heavy cream stock, the gold notary seal. He recognized it instantly. I physically saw the moment his soul left his body. His knees visibly buckled, and he gripped the mahogany railing to keep from collapsing onto the stairs. "You signed this, didn't you?" I asked softly, my voice carrying dangerous, undeniable weight. "You pledged this very house as collateral for a $5 million loan. A house you do not own, a house that belongs to a trust." He stammered, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He looked frantically around the room for an ally, for someone to laugh and tell him this was just a bad nightmare. But no one laughed. The wealthy investors were staring at him with cold, predatory eyes. They smelled blood in the water. "And do you know who owns the blind trust, Bradley?" I asked, my voice echoing in the cavernous foyer. "I do." I let the words hang there in the heavy air. I let him do the agonizing math in his head. If I owned the trust, I owned the house. If I owned the house, I owned him. He had just committed federal wire fraud to steal from a billionaire. Vanessa started to cry. It was a high, thin, pathetic sound, like a kettle boiling over. "Dad, please," she sobbed, clutching the hem of her expensive designer dress. "Don't do this. Not here. Not in front of everyone." I looked at her then. I looked at the daughter I had raised, the girl whose tuition I had paid, whose tears I had dried. "You had your chance, Vanessa," I said, my voice completely devoid of pity. "You had a chance when she was shivering on the porch in the freezing rain. You had a chance when he was heavily drugging her food to make her compliant. You chose your side. Now you have to live with the absolute consequences." I turned my back on her and raised my voice, addressing the guests, the board members, the absolute elite of Greenwich society. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced, projecting my voice clearly over the stunned crowd. "I apologize for the interruption. My son-in-law was just telling you about the future of global tech. About character, about resilience." I gestured to Bradley, who was now trembling visibly. "But I think there is something you should know before you toast to his success." I looked directly at Marcus Sterling. "Marcus," I said, "would you mind joining us?" The crowd parted again. Marcus Sterling walked forward. He didn't look at Bradley, he looked at me. "Mr. Dalton," he said, clearing his throat and extending his hand. I shook it firmly. "Mr. Sterling," I said, "I believe you have some paperwork for your CFO." Bradley made a noise that sounded exactly like a dying animal. "Mr. Sterling," he whispered, reaching a trembling hand out toward his boss. You know him?" Marcus turned to Bradley, His face was a mask of pure professional disgust. "Bradley," he said coldly, "I would like to officially introduce you to Clifford Dalton, the founder and chairman of Trident Holdings, our parent company." Bradley's knees finally gave out entirely. He sat down hard on the stairs, burying his face in his hands as a dry, ragged sob tore from his throat. "He owns Global Tech, Bradley," Marcus continued mercilessly, his voice echoing off the marble floor. "He owns the entire company. He signs your paychecks. And tonight," I said, stepping forward until I was standing directly over him, my shadow falling heavily across his crumpled, pathetic form, "tonight, I am here to fire you." The gasp from the crowd was audible. Beatrice squeezed my arm gently. I looked at her. She was smiling. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of absolute, unfiltered justice. "But we are not just firing you, Bradley," I said, leaning down so only he and the front row could hear. "We are evicting you." I pulled another document from my pocket. The eviction notice Leonard Katz had drafted. I dropped it onto his lap. It landed with a soft slap against his ruined tuxedo pants. "Get out of my house," I commanded. The document fluttered onto Bradley's lap like a dead bird. He stared at it, his hands shaking so violently he couldn't even pick it up. The eviction notice, the absolute end of his reign, but I wasn't done. The eviction was just the opening act. The main event was about to begin. I turned away from him, leaving him crumpled on the stairs, and walked toward the small stage where the jazz trio had been playing earlier. The musicians had stopped, their instruments lowered, watching the drama unfold with wide, terrified eyes. I reached out and took the microphone from its stand. "Testing," I said. My voice boomed through the speakers, filling every corner of the massive room. I looked out at the sea of faces. These were the people Bradley had preened for. These were the people he had tried to impress with his borrowed wealth and his stolen stories. "You know," I began, my tone conversational but edged with sharpened steel. "My son-in-law here has a very interesting definition of family. He told you earlier that family takes care of family. He told you he was a saint for taking in his poor, demented in-laws." I paused, letting the silence stretch tightly. I looked directly at a wealthy woman in the front row who was clutching her pearls in shock. "But he left out a few critical details," I continued, pacing slowly across the stage. "He forgot to mention that the sanctuary he provided was a storage shed without heat. He forgot to mention that the care he provided involved deliberately drugging my wife with heavy antipsychotics to simulate advanced dementia, so he could commit her to an asylum and steal her remaining assets. And he certainly forgot to mention that the money he used to throw this lavish party, to buy his custom suits, to lease his luxury sports cars, it didn't come from his salary. It came from forging my wife's signature and stealing her emergency medical fund." A collective gasp of sheer horror went through the room. Murmurs of disgust erupted among the board members. Bradley made a strangled noise, trying to stand up, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. "That's a lie!" he screamed, his voice cracking hysterically, spit flying from his lips. "He's crazy, don't listen to him." "He's senile," I smiled into the microphone. It was the smile of a man holding 4 aces senile. I asked, "That is an interesting diagnosis, Bradley, especially coming from a man who just signed a federal affidavit, pledging a property he doesn't own to secure a fraudulent loan." I held the affidavit up again for the entire room to see. "This is a sworn statement, notarized 3 days ago, in which Bradley declares himself the sole owner of this estate. He used it to try and borrow $5 million from a private equity firm." I walked over to Marcus Sterling. "Marcus," I said into the mic, "you are a businessman. What do you call it when an executive leverages assets he doesn't control to cover his massive personal debts?" Marcus took the microphone from me. His face was grim and uncompromising. "We call it embezzlement, Clifford, and we call it fraud." He turned to the crowd, addressing the horrified investors. "For those of you who don't know, I am Marcus Sterling, CEO of Global Tech Solutions. And the man standing next to me is Clifford Dalton, founder and chairman of Trident Holdings. Trident acquired Global Tech 6 months ago, which means, Bradley, that Clifford isn't just your father-in-law. He is your boss." The realization hit Bradley like a physical blow to the stomach. The arrogance, the smug superiority had all evaporated in an instant, leaving behind only naked primal terror. You, he stammered, pointing a shaking finger at me. You can't be, you drive a truck. You wear flannel. I laughed harshly. I drive a truck because I like the open road. Bradley, I wear flannel because it is comfortable. But don't ever mistake my hobbies for my net worth. I built an empire from scratch while you were still learning how to tie your tie. I have negotiated with massive labor unions, with international cartels, with foreign governments. Do you really think a little pathetic thief like you could outsmart me? I walked back to him, leaning down close so he could smell the expensive cologne I was wearing. You called us leeches, I whispered. You said we were a burden. You wiped your muddy shoes on my wife's shoulder, and all the while you were living in my house, spending my money, working for my company. Who is the leech, Bradley? Who is the actual parasite? He shrank back against the stairs, whimpering like a beaten dog. I didn't know, he sobbed, tears finally spilling down his cheeks. I swear to God I didn't know you had money. If you had known I was rich, you would have treated me with respect? I asked, my voice dripping with absolute disgust. Is that it? You only treat people like human beings if they have a big enough bank account. That is exactly the problem, Bradley. That is why you are finished, not because you stole, but because you are fundamentally cruel. You are a small, cruel man who thought he found a helpless victim. But you found a judge. I straightened up and looked at Marcus. Marcus, I think it is time for that performance review. Marcus nodded. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek black envelope. He walked up the stairs, stopping one step below Bradley. Bradley, he said formally, his voice carrying the finality of an executioner's axe. Effective immediately, your employment with Global Tech is terminated for cause. We have uncovered significant financial irregularities in your department. Unauthorized transfers, falsified expense reports, using company funds to cover massive personal gambling debts. Gambling debts? Vanessa shrieked from the bottom of the stairs. She looked at her husband with absolute, unadulterated horror. You told me you were investing in a startup. I was, Bradley yelled back, desperate and cornered. It was a sure thing, I just needed more time. Marcus ignored the pathetic outburst. Security is already clearing out your office, Bradley. Your corporate accounts are frozen, and our legal team has already forwarded our findings to the district attorney. You are facing charges of corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and securities fraud. He handed the envelope to Bradley. It fell to the floor, landing next to the eviction notice. Get out of my sight, Marcus said, but the show wasn't quite over. I had one more player to introduce to the board. I looked toward the back of the room. Leonard Katz was standing there, holding a leather briefcase. He nodded to me. Ladies and gentlemen, I said into the microphone. There is one more thing. I beckoned Leonard forward. This is Leonard Katz, my lead attorney. Leonard, would you please explain the current legal status of the residents of this estate? Leonard walked to the center of the room. His voice projected with the practiced clarity of a courtroom veteran. The property is held in a blind trust, Leonard stated. The trust agreement contains a strict morality clause. It states the tenancy is contingent upon the residents maintaining a standard of ethical conduct and providing adequate care for any family members residing on the premises. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a stack of large, glossy 8x10 photos. He held them up for the crowd to see. They were the photos Dr. Evans had taken at Mount Sinai. The deep purple bruises on Beatrice's frail arms, the bed sores, the stark evidence of malnutrition. Based on the indisputable medical evidence of severe elder abuse, neglect, and chemical assault collected by medical professionals, Leonard continued, his voice ringing with righteous fury, the trust has invoked the immediate termination clause. Bradley and Vanessa are hereby evicted. They are trespassing as of this exact moment. He turned to the security team I had hired. Gentlemen, please escort the trespassers off the property immediately. Bradley scrambled up, his eyes wild with a feral, cornered panic. He wildly tried to run up the grand staircase, perhaps attempting to lock himself in the master bedroom, perhaps desperately searching for a weapon, or simply trying to flee from the overwhelming reality crashing down on him. But the private security guards I hired were much faster and far more experienced than a soft corporate executive. Two of them moved in a blur of black suits. They grabbed him firmly by the arms before he could even reach the third step. No, you can't do this, Bradley screamed, thrashing violently against their iron grips. This is my house. I am the CEO. I am important. You people are nothing. You are nothing, I shouted, my voice thundering over his pathetic screams, silencing the room. You are a fraud, and you are done. They dragged him forcefully down the stairs. He kicked and screamed like an overgrown toddler throwing a tantrum. His expensive custom tuxedo jacket ripped loudly at the shoulder seam. His patent leather shoes, the same shoes he had used to wipe mud onto my wife, scuffed loudly on the pristine marble floor he had so arrogantly claimed to own. Vanessa ran to me. She grabbed my arm, her face stained with ruined makeup and frantic tears. Dad, please stop them. He is my husband. You can't let them throw him out into the street. Where will we go? How will we live? I looked down at her manicured hands clutching my tuxedo sleeve. I felt nothing. The paternal warmth that had guided me for 30 years was completely extinguished. I gently but very firmly removed her hands from my arm. You can go absolutely wherever you want, Vanessa, I said coldly. But you cannot stay here. Not for another minute, Dad, please. I didn't do anything. I am innocent. It was all him. You watched, I corrected her, my tone uncompromising. You watched him wipe his muddy shoes on her frail shoulder. You watched him drug her food to make her compliant. You watched him systematically starve the woman who birthed you. And you did absolutely nothing because you wanted the Range Rover. You wanted the luxury lifestyle and the country club memberships. I pointed a rigid finger toward the front door. You made your choice. You chose the money over your own mother. Well, the money is completely gone, and so is your father. She recoiled violently, as if I had physically slapped her across the face. She looked desperately at Beatrice, who was standing tall and regal in her velvet gown. Mom, she whispered, her voice breaking. Mom, please help me. Please tell him to stop. Beatrice looked at her daughter. Her eyes were deeply sad, reflecting a profound sense of loss, but they were completely dry. I helped you for 30 years, Vanessa, she said softly, her voice carrying an unshakable finality. I gave you everything I had. I supported every dream you ever had, and in return you gave me a wet rubber doormat to sleep on in the freezing rain. Goodbye. The guards dragged Bradley toward the front door. He was openly sobbing now, abandoning all pretense of dignity. He was begging Marcus Sterling for a second chance, begging me for mercy, promising to pay the money back. I watched him go. I watched the monster who had terrorized my wife being hauled out like the garbage he truly was. And then, just as they reached the threshold of the open doors, the piercing wail of sirens shattered the night air. The flashing blue and red lights of police cruisers violently illuminated the rain-slicked driveway, casting chaotic shadows into the foyer. I smiled. Leonard Katz had timed it perfectly. The police aren't here for the eviction, I announced to the silent, stunned room of wealthy investors. They are here for the federal felonies. 6 federal agents wearing heavy windbreakers emblazoned with the yellow letters, FBI, stormed through the grand entrance. They didn't stop to ask questions. They knew exactly who they were looking for. Bradley Thompson. The lead agent shouted, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. Bradley actually tried to run. The sheer adrenaline of terror gave him a burst of strength. He tried to violently shake off the private security guards and bolt for the kitchen door leading to the garage. It was a pathetic, desperate scramble. The FBI agents tackled him before he made it 3 feet. They slammed him onto the hard marble floor face first with a sickening thud. You are under arrest for wire fraud, bank fraud, and conspiracy to commit elder abuse, the agent recited, forcefully pulling Bradley's arms behind his back and snapping cold steel handcuffs around his wrists. We have a sworn, notarized affidavit signed by you, pledging assets you do not legally own to a federal informant. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. I watched as they hauled him roughly to his feet. His nose was bleeding freely from the impact with the floor, staining his crisp white shirt. His custom suit was ruined. He looked at me, his eyes wild with sheer, unadulterated terror. Clifford, please, I'm family. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. Tell them we can work it out. I looked at the man who had starved my wife and locked her in a dark basement. I have no family in this room, I said simply. They dragged him out the door, his screams fading into the rainy night as they shoved him forcefully into the back of a federal vehicle. The flashing lights disappeared down the long driveway, taking the nightmare away forever. The room was silent again. The only sound was the soft, broken sobbing coming from the bottom of the grand staircase. Vanessa was kneeling on the floor, surrounded by the wealthy friends she had tried so hard to impress, who were now looking at her with absolute disgust. Her husband was gone. Her house was gone. Her reputation in Greenwich was permanently incinerated. She crawled toward me on her hands and knees, reaching out for the hem of my trousers. "Daddy, please," she choked out, reverting to the name she used when she was a little girl. "I didn't know about the fraud. I swear I am innocent. Please don't let them take me. I have nowhere to go. They froze all the bank accounts." "You are not innocent, Vanessa," I said softly, looking down at her. "You are the bystander who eagerly profited from the pain. You are complicit, but I'm your daughter," she wailed, burying her face in her hands. "You can't leave me on the street. I don't know how to survive without him." "You liked the maid uniform so much," I said, my voice as hard as a diamond. "You liked treating your mother like a servant." I reached into my tuxedo pocket and pulled out a small piece of cardstock. It was a business card for a large commercial cleaning service in the city. "If you need money, Vanessa, I suggest you learn how to scrub a floor. I hear they are hiring the night shift." I dropped the card. It fluttered down and landed on the marble floor right in front of her face. "The trust is dissolved. The inheritance is gone. You are completely on your own." I turned my back on her, leaving her weeping on the floor, and offered my arm to Beatrice. "Come on, Bae. Let's go home. Not this house, our real home. 6 months ago, I was a man standing in the freezing rain, watching my world crumble while jazz music played behind a closed door. Today, I am sitting on a wide wooden porch that smells of salt spray and cedar wood, watching the Atlantic Ocean roll in against the rocky, beautiful coast of Maine. Beatrice is down in the garden below the porch. She is wearing a wide-brimmed sun hat and worn gardening gloves, kneeling happily in the rich dirt, carefully planting a row of blue hydrangeas. She isn't wearing diamonds today. She is wearing comfortable jeans and a simple linen shirt, and to me, she has never looked more beautiful. The horrific bruises that mapped her arms and legs are completely gone. The hollows in her cheeks have filled out with healthy color. Her skin is bronzed by the sun and glowing with renewed vitality. But the most important, profound change is in her eyes. The dark, chemical twilight they forced her into has lifted completely. She doesn't flinch when a door slams. She doesn't hide when someone speaks loudly. She is Beatrice again. Sharp, funny, deeply loving, and entirely mine. We sold the Greenwich estate 3 days after that fateful party. I had Leonard liquidated entirely, furniture, artwork, and all. I didn't want a single silver spoon or silk cushion that Bradley had touched to remain in our lives. We took a small portion of the money and bought this 4-bedroom, shingle-style house on a cliff overlooking the water. It doesn't have a grand sweeping staircase or a marble foyer, but it has a soul. It is filled with light, fresh air, and peace. Justice moves slower than revenge, but it hits much harder because it is painfully, undeniably final. For Bradley Thompson, justice is a cage made of concrete and steel, located in a high-security federal penitentiary in upstate New York. The trial was an absolute media spectacle. Leonard Katz had assembled a case so airtight it would have suffocated Houdini. The fraudulent affidavit Bradley signed with Arthur Vance, combined with the horrifying medical evidence of elder abuse, ensured there was no high-priced defense attorney on earth who could save him. The judge showed absolutely no mercy. He sentenced Bradley to 10 years for the multiple fraud charges, to be served consecutively, with an additional 5 years for the elder abuse and chemical assault. 15 years total. He will be 55 years old when he finally gets out. He has no money, no career, and a federal felony record that will ensure he never steps foot in a corporate boardroom again, unless he is emptying the trash cans. Because I legally owned all of his debt, I liquidated his remaining assets to the absolute penny. The stolen Porsche was repossessed. The accounts were drained. He went into federal prison as a complete pauper. Vanessa's sentence was entirely different. She managed to avoid prison time, as prosecutors ultimately decided her role in the fraud and the abuse was largely passive. She didn't sign the documents, and she didn't physically administer the drugs. But freedom, I quickly learned, can be its own kind of inescapable, crushing prison. I went to see her exactly once, about 3 months after the trial concluded. I didn't speak to her. I didn't want a reconciliation. I just needed to see with my own eyes that the cycle of greed and abuse had been irrevocably broken. She was working at a large discount grocery store in Queens, living in a cramped, moldy basement apartment with 2 roommates because her credit was utterly destroyed by association. I parked my car across the street and watched through the large glass window. Vanessa stood behind the checkout register, wearing a cheap, scratchy polyester smock that was 2 sizes too big for her. I watched as a large, aggressive customer started yelling at her over an expired 50-cent coupon. He pointed a thick finger directly in her face. He called her stupid and incompetent. I watched my daughter flinch. I watched her hunch her shoulders, physically trying to make herself smaller, trying to disappear. It was the exact same defeated, terrified posture Beatrice had adopted when Bradley yelled at her on the porch. Then, the angry man aggressively knocked over an open carton of milk on the checkout counter. "Clean it up," he shouted, tossing the expired coupon at her. Vanessa didn't argue. She didn't fight back. She grabbed a dirty rag from under the counter and bent down. She started furiously scrubbing the counter. Some of the sour milk dripped off the edge and onto her cheap canvas shoes. She wiped her shoe with the rag, her head bowed in total, humiliating submission. The irony was so sharp it felt like a physical cut to my heart. She had happily allowed her husband to treat her mother like a maid, to wipe his muddy shoes on her shoulder while she drank wine. And now, the universe had put her in the exact same uniform. She was the maid. She was the one cleaning up the mess, being humiliated and verbally abused for a minimum wage paycheck that barely covered her rent. She looked up through the glass. For a brief second, our eyes met across the busy street. I saw the deep shame flood her face, turning her cheeks red. She took a tentative step toward the window, her hand raising slightly in a desperate plea. She wanted me to save her. She wanted me to walk in, buy the store, and take her back to a life of luxury and comfort. I didn't move. I didn't smile. I simply looked at her, acknowledging her harsh new reality. And then I rolled up the tinted window of my car and drove away. Leaving her there, scrubbing sour milk off a counter, was the most honest, necessary, and painful thing I had ever done for her. She was finally building a life with her own hands, and she was learning the true value of $1. True power isn't about shouting at waiters, wearing custom suits, or wiping your shoes on people you arrogantly think are beneath you. True power is the quiet ability to protect the people you love. It is the ability to stand in the freezing rain, humiliated and dismissed, and know with absolute certainty that you have the strength to bring the whole house down whenever you choose. I chose to bring it down because they hurt Beatrice. If they had just stolen the money, I might have just cut them off and let them fail on their own. But they tried to break her spirit, they tried to steal her mind, and for that, there is absolutely no forgiveness. There is only the cold, hard, inescapable correction of reality. My name is Clifford Dalton. I am a retired truck driver. I am a billionaire, and I am the man who taught his family the true, devastating cost of greed. Thank you for listening to my story. If you enjoyed this, please like the video and subscribe to the channel for more stories about justice served cold. And tell me in the comments down below, would you have forgiven Vanessa after seeing her scrub that counter, or did she get exactly what she deserved? I will see you in the next story.